and welcome to the 56th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's Anglophone novel. I'll spend the first few minutes just very briefly wrapping up some thoughts on Tsitsi Dangarembga's nervous conditions, and then quickly move on to the next writer that we are going to consider, who is Michelle Cliff. So I ended the previous lecture by talking about this very repeatable moment and very frequently repeated moment in which the narrators or protagonists of Bildungsroman, both in the Victorian context as well as in the turn of the century, and I took the examples of Jane Eyre and Dorian Gray, their growth is interrupted but also propelled forward in very particular ways that's influenced by their encounter with particular books. And these encounters are also not simple encounters of reading the books. Of course, they do involve some reading, but more importantly than the actual reading of the words and the interpretation of the words in the book, what matters is some conflict, which often also leads to violence, a conflict between individuals or communities who have very different ideas of how human beings should be. In the case of Jane Eyre, it's a conflict between Mrs. Reed's children who think that because Jane is an orphan and is given shelter in their home, Jane should be extremely submissive, should be like a servant or a slave, and should not exercise any sovereignty or individuality. So when he sees Jane reading this boy, he hurls a book at her and very violently tries to show her her place. So this is a difference of opinion which leads to a conflict and violence. In the case of Dorian Gray, the conflict is between people who think that queerness or intimacy between people of the same sex is unnatural, is criminal, is violent, or comes from a place of sickness or moral depravity, and so on. This is one set of people who think that. And the other set of people who think that, who don't have a choice, but who act as they feel and as they feel to be the most natural way to act, which is to simply treat queerness not as a choice or as a depravity or as a sin, but as simply a way of completing oneself, simply as a way of finding meaning, finding identity, finding a sense of fulfillment and meaning as an individual in the world in which we are born. So in both these cases, the encounter with the book follows from and exacerbates this conflict and difference of opinion between people and communities. And this exacerbation of the conflict has a consequence on the way the individual's growth takes place. In the case of Jane Eyre, Jane's individuality, Jane's resolve, Jane's independence is strengthened by this violence. Similarly, in the case of Dorian Gray, Dorian becomes more violent, almost criminal. Dorian is depraved, criminalized by the society which criminalizes a very basic human impulse. Similar instances can be found in several other post-colonial novels and short story collections. A somewhat humorous, less tragic, but no less important treatment of the importance of education and specifically how the pressure to read, especially the pressure to read and understand English, can lead to complicated developments of young children can be found in R.K. Narayan's Swami and Friends. The English language is a source of fear and a source of pressure for Swami, and the boys find their own ways of negotiating and growing and really developing, finding success, finding progress by working through the discomfort that their English teachers and their English books produce for them. So this is a thing. I referred to The God of Small Things. The God of Small Things is a novel that can be read very powerfully alongside Nervous Conditions. They were written less than 10 years apart, and there are uncanny similarities, both in the way these female protagonists develop, but also in the way they diagnose the violence that their female protagonists suffer, as well as the male characters inflict, through a reading of the kind of cultural education and the kind of books, movies, songs, all in English, which are received and interpreted in radically different ways by the men and the women. So, education is important, and education encourages the growth and development of male and female characters in very different ways in specifically post-colonial Bildungsroman. So that's a little bit of context for the descriptions of Lady Chatterley's lover in Nervous Conditions. A few more comments about what happens in nervous conditions. Nyasha develops severe eating disorders. Nyasha begins to evacuate her bowels from her mouth immediately after she is force-fed meals at Baba Mukuru's very grand, very modern, very Western, and very, very palatial house. This house is where Tambu for the first time sees things like dining tables. This is the dining table is a site of conflict and even wars. The war is between women who are forced to remain silent and one man who, empowered through his masculinity but also through the cultural education that he has got from England, decides to suppress them and really ram down their throats, quite literally, nourishment that he thinks is good for them. The difference that the novel allows us to notice very painfully and in a very disturbing manner is the difference between how Tambu and Nyasha react to this violence. The difference is that Nyasha is more overt in her resistance, is less obedient, and Tambu, given the stakes, given how much more Tambu had to lose, and the extreme poverty from which Tambu had come from, and the potential to reverse her fortunes and to depart from the script that was set for her. Tambu has a lot more at stake, and therefore it's much more harder for Tambu, honestly speaking, to disobey. Nonetheless, the observable difference is that Tambu obeys and Nyasha disobeys. And this allows us to see the novel's description of progress in a very ghostly manner. Tambu's progress, Tambu's position at the end of the novel, a very promising position, must be read. And in fact, the novel ensures that we cannot escape this reading. We cannot not see the ghost of Nyasha's suffering in Tambu's success. This is the final tragic and very poignant idea that the novel leaves us with, and it really asks us to ponder this very important post-colonial question, which is, what is the cost of progress? What do we have to let go in order to ensure that we get the benefits that a colonial modernity ensures that people can have? And in many ways, living in post-colonial nations requires that we ponder this question every day, if not several times a day, when we see that development comes with great human costs. We see that there are a lot of modern infrastructures being developed, but at the same time, we also see that some very basic human needs, some very essential human requirements, needs that human beings have to live a life of dignity, these very basic needs are being denied. So we see that, just to take one example, to take the example of healthcare, for instance, we see that there are many hospitals and institutions of healthcare being constructed all over India. But we also see that many of these institutions, which are meant to make the lives of people better, many of these public spaces, public buildings, do not have spaces to ensure that women can live a life of dignity, that women can feel safe. So, for instance, many hospitals which require female doctors to work 24/7 do not have spaces where women can retire, can change, can feel safe without the threat of violence. And this applies to many other public spaces as well. And what's the contradiction here, or why must we think about this as a case of colonial and post-colonial development, forcing us to ask this question: what is the cost of development? The cost of development is a full, a complete ethical education of what it means to be human. So, to return to the example of public buildings or hospitals that do not have safe retiring spaces or rooms for women, whoever designed the building, whoever laid the stones and created this brick and mortar building, everyone from the theoretical designer, the architect, to the poorest manual laborer and the construction worker, it is required that everyone involved in creating this marker of development in post-colonial nations understand the need for human dignity and understand specifically the need for human dignity as it applies to men and women. And so, unless that full ethical education is achieved, the material markers of development will always be incomplete. Not only will they be incomplete, but they will become sites of suffering and sites of violence. Violence that the state, the post colonial state, allows to be inflicted through men on women because it has not considered this kind of an ethical education of its subjects, rich or poor, young or old. This ethical education, which understands that whether a subject is male or female, rich or poor, they deserve the right and the space to live a life of dignity. So, in a way, I'm allegorizing here and I'm speaking in general terms, but these are the kinds of intellectual and moral questions that a novel like Nervous Conditions forces us to ask. What can we do to ensure that development is complete and holistic? The last page of the novel leaves us wondering, how happy can Tambu really be in a world where people like Baba Mukurus are to be found everywhere? And till what extent can Tambu keep her resistance quiet, muted? Till what extent can Tambu keep suppressing her dissent? To be clear, the novel does not describe Tambu as entirely obedient. She does resist and she's punished for it as well. But her punishment, as I've noted, is nowhere near the kind of punishment that Nyasha receives. So the novel really asks a very poignant question, which is, how much development does Tambu need? How much of this, for want of a better word, insensitive or blind or patriarchal or masculinist development does Tambu need before she can take on the role of resisting and creating a more ethical, a more humane educational system for those that will follow? Tambu's education is damaged, it is flawed, severely flawed, and Tambu is a product of a damaged education system. The hope and the promise that the novel fills us with, given the kinds of empathetic descriptions of the lack of dignity that women had to live with, the hope is that Tambu will change the tide, that this buck will stop with Tambu, and when Tambu has a chance, she will be as different, as diametrically opposed to Baba Mukuru as possible, because she has seen both sides of it. She has seen the potential of development as well as the violence that development brings with it if it comes without a sensitive and perceptive and ethical education. Okay, I'll stop there and move to the next writer in this course, which is the Jamaican American novelist Michelle Cliff. Now, Michelle Cliff was born in 1946 in Jamaica and passed away in 2016. Michelle Cliff is a somewhat challenging writer but I think an extremely important writer. I'll begin by reading from essay that Michelle Cliff wrote in 1978, among the first articulations of what she understood to be her mission, her, her ethical and creative task as a writer. Cliff was a prolific writer, worked in multiple genres, wrote poems, short stories, novels, and also a lot of criticism. In this essay, Michelle Cliff writes, "To reject speechlessness, a process which has taken years, and to invent my own peculiar speech with which to describe my own peculiar self, to draw together everything I and have been." So it's clear that Michelle Cliff's ambition in her career as a writer is to arrive at a place of honesty, to arrive at a place of truthfulness, and the ability to speak about herself in a truthful, honest manner is both a goal that the writer desires, but it is also something that the writer knows with certainty that it will produce a very new kind of authority and power. This is because Michelle Cliff was born into a kind of family, a kind of ethnicity, a kind of body, and a kind of sensibility, all of which combined to silence her, to become a series of compounded pressures, a series of compounded forces that excluded her from speaking as she truly was. So, what were these facts? What were these accidents of birth and history which combined to silence her? Michelle Cliff was born in Kingston, Jamaica, to a light skinned black family. Michelle Cliff had very, very light skin, but she was born in a black family. This was the first. Second, Michelle Cliff was not straight, did not conform to the expectations that normal heterosexual women were expected to. She did not play the roles that normal heterosexual women were expected to play. She was queer at different times, describing herself as bisexual and lesbian. Later on, as the politics and the cultures and the legal frameworks around homosexuality became more permissive, she leaned into her lesbianism much more openly. So, a light skinned black lesbian woman from Jamaica, right? This was already quite constricting and quite silencing for her, even while she was in Jamaica. But this was not enough because she had to add another complicating and constricting identity marker to this already long list, which was that she was an immigrant for many, many stretches of her childhood, youth, and professional adult life. Their family moved to England for many years, where Cliff had an education, then came back to Jamaica, where Cliff finished her school and college. And then Cliff went to the US for many years for her doctoral education and began to build a career as a professor, writer, and scholar in the US. So, in addition to being a light skinned black woman, Cliff was also a lesbian and an immigrant. Now, this is one way of describing how some very basic facts of her birth and her presence in certain spaces and in certain communities combined to produce what she calls was speechlessness, or the inability to speak, but also an inability to be heard. It's not that she could not speak or write, but it was that her speech was not registered. And so speechlessness is not a question of disability, of being mute, but more a question of a lack of recognition. It's a comment on the world in which she found herself, the world in which the people whose job it was to listen to her and to pay attention refused to do so because before her words could reach them, the facts of her identity had already closed their ears to what this person might say. I'll read some information from the 2016 New York Times obituary, which really helps establish a great deal of context and intellectual frame for understanding Michelle Cliff's work. The book that I find most useful to think through many of the themes, the tone, and the style of Michelle Cliff's writing is her second book of prose and poetry, which is titled The Land of Look Behind, Prose and Poetry, published 1985. This was published after her first novel, that's Abeng, was published, and in the year 1984. The novel that I'll focus on in this and the next lecture is a second novel published in the year 1987, which is titled No Telephone to Heaven. Before I get to that novel, I want to focus a little bit on a very important theme in Cliff's writing, which helps us connect Cliff's work to a very important cultural and theoretical history of queer writing as it has emerged in North American Anglophone writing. The second book of criticism, the book The Land of Look Behind, Prose and Poetry, this title actually helps build that connection. The Land of Look Behind. It conveys a space in which people tend to have one dominant tendency, which is to look behind. The space is not a literal space, but it's an intellectual and emotional space. What it's describing in this title is that the writer, Michelle Cliff, occupies an emotional terrain in which she tends to look back, in which she tends to remember things. The act of remembering is freighted with a lot of baggage, a lot of cultural, social, and intellectual baggage. It's not simply a task of looking back and remembering how things were. It's difficult to look back because the time and the space which one is trying to recreate is trapped under or locked under some difficult feelings of insult, indignation, and to use a word which will be used by many queer theorists, shame. So it's difficult to cut through the shame to look back on things that need to be looked back. This is why looking back is not easy. The other reason why looking back is not easy or simple is that looking back, once completed, will lead to a process of recreation, a restoration of self, and the re-establishment of an identity which itself is incomplete. So looking back is first difficult because it requires cutting through shameful memories. It requires accepting and confronting experiences of indignation and insult. The second part of this, once all this difficult work is done, there's no guarantee that looking back will help establish an identity because the legal conditions that are required to restore that self, which was annihilated by shame, still don't exist. Which is to say, Michelle Cliff, when remembering her childhood, is trying to establish an identity for herself as an adult, as a successful lesbian, black, Jamaican writer in the US. But even that identity is not yet complete because she will not be able to openly declare her queerness without threat of legal persecution. So Michelle Cliff's writing is filled with this dual sense. On one hand, the pressure and the need to revisit shameful and painful memories. On the other hand, this awareness that even if one manages to do that, those memories will require a strong legal intervention, widespread legal intervention, if those memories are to help the writer create an identity for herself. So the final effect of Michelle Cliff's writing, and we'll see this in No Telephone to Heaven, is that the best that these memories, the best that the emotional labor of cutting through shame can do is to come to a point where the self looks forward to an indefinite future in which her identity may be realized. So, a character that Michelle Cliff creates as an emotional doppelganger, as a sort of foil for her own emotional development, is Claire Savage. Claire Savage is very much like Michelle Cliff, but Claire Savage's development stops at a point where Claire dies, in fact, before she's able to affirm what she will truly become, and how powerfully she can write about herself. Uh, Claire dies before queerness is allowed to exist, not as a disease or as a criminal, but as a right-bearing citizen. And so these two modes, looking back and looking forward, looking back to a painful past, looking forward to a utopian or a hope-filled time of possibility. This is the double bind in which Michelle Cliff's writing exists, and I'll discuss this double bind by reference to queer theory as well as discussions of her novel No Telephone to Heaven in the next lecture. Thank you.